This is the Voice of Russia from London. I'm Tim Ecott. The conflict in Syria continues to divide the country internally, with more than 1 million people estimated to have fled the borders to seek safety in Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, Iraq and Kurdistan. International efforts to mediate have divided opinions on the rights and wrongs of whether President Bashar al-Assad should remain in power and what, if any, level of foreign intervention may be appropriate. While the opposition factions are said to number as many as 1,000 disparate groups, some said to be backed by al-Qaeda, finding common ground between them seems unlikely. European Union nations, the USA, Russia and China all disagree on what can and should be done to solve the impasse. And from outside Syria, it's difficult to accurately gauge what's really happening. Anti-Assad groups get the lion's share of media attention. Mimi Al Laham is a Syrian activist who attracts a significant following on social media around the world with her views. She says she's proud to be Syrian and believes that the integrity of Syrian nationhood is what's really at stake in the civil war. She's unhappy at the way foreign media portray her country, and although she claims she's not a supporter of President Assad, she thinks removing him could be dangerous.
Well, I think in the Western media portrays Syria as only two sides: pro-government supporters and anti-government fighters that support the militant uprising. But really, there's a large silent majority in Syria that want to see a reform process. They don't want to see the country descend into chaos, for the army to collapse, for outside forces to interfere inside Syria. And we recognize the corruption inside the government. We recognize that a lot of people have a legitimate reason to oppose the government. However, we do not agree that fighting on your own people is a solution, nor accepting weapons from the West, who have traditionally not supported Syria's claim to return of her sovereign land in the Golan Heights.
So do you in fact fear that if Mr. Assad is removed as president, that other forces will come into play and that Syria's integrity as a sovereign nation could be under threat?
Assad is a symbol for Syria's sovereignty. He is keeping the army intact. If he were to fall, it would be a sign of weakness and would cause a chain reaction of defections, of people running away from the front lines. So he needs to stay on and see this through. I mean, even people who are against him and have been ardent opposition to him for decades, my family being one of them, see this as a fact. And without Syria's defenses, it is very likely that there's going to be interference from outside.
Who do you fear most would interfere with the internal affairs of Syria?
You can say this simultaneously, Israel and the US, because Israel has been the border enemy to Syria for the last, since its inception. And they say that rebel groups in Syria could become a future threat, which would be a reason for them to reoccupy. So they're already planning.
The view of many people is that there is such disorganization and so many rival factions on the rebel side, and some of those rebels are clearly groups who would pose a significant threat to Israel, but also to other Western nations because of their extremist views and potential links to al-Qaeda.
Well, the problem is that the US has created al-Qaeda in the 80s in Afghanistan. They've been funding it since then.
But not
and
now.
They pretend, al-Qaeda is seen as, America's worst enemy. Wherever al-Qaeda is, America has an excuse to attack. For the way I see it, al-Qaeda is just like another WMD. Wherever the US needs to impose its hegemony and imperialism, that's where al-Qaeda is going to be. If they need to support them, like they did in Libya, like they are doing now in Syria, like they do in Afghanistan, they will support them. When they need them as an excuse for war, like they are doing in Mali now, that's what will happen. And I think that, al-Qaeda might pose a threat to regular people inside the populations of America and Britain and Europe, but the threat to a military or a government or the...
But isn't that what in a democratic country the government has to do, is protect its own people? That is their main function, to protect their people from organizations that seek to harm those people.
Well, that is their function, and I think that when there is an outside threat, that's a great excuse to take people's liberties and to enforce more control over their private lives. And also that is, of course, one of the other agendas that government have to control.
But are you denying that al-Qaeda is a threat to the West?
No, not at all. I would say that it's a controlled threat to the West.
You said that what you would fear is that if President Assad was removed, that Syria would descend into chaos. The picture we're given outside Syria is that it is already a country in chaos. How much worse could things get?
Well, for one thing, the sectarian violence has been only on one side, really. Up to this point, the sectarianism against the Alawite minorities and the Christians has been from the FSA side. And you could say that when the militias take over, it could be both sides being sectarian. Without the army there, the biggest escalation would be foreign intervention. And that's when you're going to have more thousands and thousands die.
But some people listening to you say that will say, well, on one hand, that makes sense for you as a Syrian to say that. But it seems also that you might be saying it's fine if it's only Syrians killing each other. What we don't want is foreigners coming in or exacerbating sectarianism. But we will put up with the current level of suffering as long as it's only Syrians fighting Syrians.
I would like an end to all fighting inside Syria, especially Syrians fighting Syrians. It's breaking the country apart. My way forward is through reform, is through dialogue. But
there seems to be no sign of dialogue, particularly between President Assad and the different rebel groups. I mean, attempts at dialogue have fallen down.
Well, dialogue is in their interests because the alternative for dialogue for the Syrian government would be total destruction of their state. You see the US block the Syrian National Council from pursuing dialogue with
How
Syria.
did they block it?
Well, if their leader, who is now stepped down, Muaz al-Khatib, said that he agreed to dialogue with the government, and then a day later, he was changed totally his tune. Syrian National Council has, or whatever they are calling it now, has never agreed to dialogue with the government.
The image being portrayed, particularly in the Western media, of President Assad is a man who is determined at whatever cost to remain in power, and he seems to be, or he is portrayed as being, oblivious to the suffering of the people in cities like Homs and Aleppo.
I can't comment for him. I would say that people are suffering. They are being caught in the crossfire in Damascus due to the terror bombings, and in the FSA-controlled areas due to the fighting between the army and the FSA. I know people who have been in rebel-controlled areas that want the army to come in, even at cost of their own livelihoods in their homes, because they don't want to live under the FSA, who has been, some of them have been more brutal and more repressive than the government has been. But of course, there are supporters of the FSA in these areas, and there are civilians being killed. It's a war, and the outside countries, specifically NATO, have fueled this war. It's a terrible thing.
But so many countries, I mean, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel, the USA, Britain and France, other EU states are saying the level that more than 1 million people now displaced from Syria, people in desperate situations, video emerging of seemingly whole villages wiped out by, they claim, government forces. Surely removing the existing government is the only way to change that drastic situation.
It's not the only way. You could stop funding al-Qaeda-linked rebels or extremists in the country. You could let the country sort itself out. Removing Assad, as I said, is going to lead to a big push by the rebel forces into the main cities, Aleppo and Damascus.
You have relatives still living in Damascus who you can communicate with. What are they actually telling you about how life can continue in the capital?
Well, my aunt was a